The first thing Leo heard, before the sirens, before the shouts from the street, was the silence from the shoebox. He'd been sitting in the dark of his studio apartment, the blue glow of his laptop the only light, the weight of another failed job application sitting on his chest like a physical thing. The air was thick with the smell of old takeout and the quiet despair of a life that hadn't turned out the way he'd planned. He was 28, living in a building that groaned with the ghosts of other people's lives, and he felt so profoundly alone that the silence had become a sound all its own. A high, thin sound, like a wire stretched too tight. And then it was gone, replaced by the crackle and the heat. The fire started in the walls, the landlord would say later. Old wiring, nothing anyone could have done. But in the moment, there was only the panic. The smoke that wasn't smoke at first, just a haze, a smell of something burning that was too close, too real. Leo's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs as he stumbled from his chair, his mind blank with a fear so pure it was almost clean. He grabbed his phone, his wallet, the stupid, instinctual things you grab, and he ran for the door. The hallway was filling with a thick, gray-black smoke that stung his eyes and clawed at his throat. He could hear other doors slamming open, voices raised in alarm, the frantic thud of footsteps on the stairs. He was halfway down the first flight, the heat at his back becoming a physical push, when he remembered. The shoebox. He'd stopped. Right there on the landing, people jostling past him, a woman clutching a crying child, shoving him forward, yelling at him to move, but he was frozen. 3 weeks. The tiny gray-furred creature had been with him for 3 weeks. A foundling, a thing of bones and silent meows he'd discovered shivering behind the dumpster in the alley. He'd meant to take her to a shelter, he really had, but the days bled into each other. And she was so quiet, so undemanding. Just a pair of wide blue eyes watching him from the safety of her cardboard castle. She was the only living thing that had looked at him in weeks without expectation, without disappointment, and he'd left her there. The guilt was a sharper pain than the heat. It was an ice pick to his gut. He turned, a stupid suicidal impulse to go back. But a fireman was there then, his face grimed with soot, his voice a roar of authority. He grabbed Leo by the arm, his grip iron strong. "It's gone, son. It's all gone. You go back in there. You don't come out. Nothing is worth that." And he was pulled, stumbling, down the rest of the stairs and out into the shocking cold of the night air. The crowd was a blur of pale, frightened faces illuminated by the frantic, swirling red lights of the fire trucks. The sound was a cacophony. The roar of the flames eating his home, the hiss of water from the hoses, the crackle of police radios, the choked sobs of his neighbors. Leo stood there, numb, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket that smelled of someone else's house, and he watched the top floor of his building, his floor, burn. Orange flames licked out of his shattered window, consuming everything. His books, the photo of his parents, the cheap couch, the laptop with half-written cover letters, the shoebox. He sank to the curb, the rough concrete scraping through his thin pajama pants, and put his head in his hands. He didn't cry. He just felt hollowed out, scraped clean. A failure at everything, even at saving the one tiny, helpless thing that had depended on him. The firemen fought for hours. The building, old and dry as tinder, put up a fierce fight, but eventually, the flames succumbed to the water. What was left was a blackened skeleton, steaming and dripping in the pre-dawn dark. It was over. The paramedics moved through the crowd, checking people, but Leo just waved them away. What was there to check? He wasn't burned. He wasn't bleeding. The injury was somewhere deep inside, a wound he couldn't show them. The sun began to rise, a pale, weak light that did nothing to warm the chill in his bones. The Red Cross was there, talking about temporary shelters, vouchers for motels. It all sounded like noise from very far away. He was just about to get into a van, to go to someplace sterile and temporary, when he saw a movement in the ruined alley next to the building. A flash of gray. His breath caught. It was probably a rat scuttling through the newfound chaos. Or a trick of the light, his grief-stricken mind playing cruel games. But he couldn't look away. He took a step away from the van, then another, his feet carrying him toward the alley almost against his will. The ground was a soggy mess of ash and runoff from the hoses. The air still held the acrid, heartbreaking smell of a home turned to cinder. And then he saw her. Crouched under the bent skeleton of the fire escape was a small, impossibly dirty shape. She was covered in a paste of wet ash and soot, her gray fur almost black with it. She was trembling, a constant, violent shudder that seemed to take over her entire tiny body. And in her mouth, she held something. She was clamped down on it with a ferocious determination, her little jaw set. It was a small, felted mouse cat toy, the one he'd bought her on a whim from the dollar store. It was soaked and filthy, but she held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. As he watched, frozen in disbelief, she took a shaky step forward. Then another. She weaved through the debris, a tiny ghost in the ruins, her eyes fixed on him. She walked right up to his feet, her body still vibrating with cold and shock and effort. She looked up at him, those same wide blue eyes peering out from a mask of grime, and slowly, carefully, she opened her soot-covered mouth. She dropped the soggy, ash-gray mouse toy onto the wet toe of his shoe. It was a quiet, almost soundless plop. A offering. A gift. She had survived an inferno. She had somehow miraculously gotten herself out, and the one thing she had chosen to save, the one thing she had carried through fire and smoke and terror, was the one little toy he had given her. She hadn't saved herself for herself. She had saved herself for him. Leo felt the air leave, his lungs in a rush. The carefully constructed numbness he'd been clinging to shattered. A sob, raw and ragged, broke from his throat. He slowly knelt down in the wet ash, the cold seeping through his pants, his hands trembling so badly he could barely control them. He didn't reach for her, not yet. He just looked at this tiny, miraculous creature, this survivor, this hero he never saw coming. She had seen him at his lowest, in the quiet of his lonely apartment, and she had come back. She had come back to him. You're here listening. And that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The motel room smelled of bleach and regret. It was a small, boxy space with thin walls, a hum from the faulty refrigerator that never quite quit, and floral bedspreads that felt stiff and foreign under his fingertips. This was the temporary shelter, the in-between place the Red Cross voucher had bought him for a week. A week to figure out the rest of his life from nothing. Leo sat on the edge of the bed, the only light coming from the pale gray dawn seeping through the slats of the blinds. In the quiet, he could hear the tiny, rasping sound of her breathing. She was in the bathroom, by his choice. He'd lined a cardboard box, a new one, from the 24-hour supermarket. With a soft towel, placed a small bowl of water, and another of the wet food the emergency vet had given him nearby. The vet, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, had checked her over in the back of her clinic just as the sun was coming up. She's a lucky little thing, the vet had said, her touch gentle as she wiped away the worst of the soot from around the kitten's eyes. Some minor smoke inhalation, a few singed whiskers. But her lungs are clear. She's dehydrated and scared, but she's tough. Tougher than she looks. She'd handed Leo a bag of supplies, refusing payment. Just take care of her. She clearly wants to be with you. Now in the sterile quiet of the motel room, the events of the night felt like a distant, terrible dream. But the proof was in the bathroom. The proof was the tiny, ash-stained mouse toy he'd placed carefully beside her box. She hadn't touched the food. She hadn't touched the water. She was curled into the tightest, smallest ball imaginable. In the farthest corner of the towel, her eyes wide open, watching the doorway where he sat. She wasn't sleeping. She was holding vigil. Leo didn't know what to do. His own life was a void of unknowns. His job search, his rent, his possessions, all of it was ash now. All he had was the clothes on his back, his wallet, his phone, and this tiny, terrified creature who had, against all odds, chosen him. The weight of that responsibility was a new kind of pressure, different from the job-seeking despair. This was sharp and immediate. He couldn't fail at this. He wouldn't. The first day passed in a haze of phone calls to insurance companies and landlord numbers that just rang and rang. Each call was a fresh exercise in frustration, a reminder of how little control he had. Between calls, he would creep to the bathroom doorway and just look. She hadn't moved. Her food was untouched. Her water bowl was still full. Her stillness was unnerving. He'd read that cats hid their pain, that they retreated when they were scared. But this felt like more than that. This felt like a profound shutting down. "You gotta eat something," he whispered from the doorway on the second morning, his voice rough from disuse and smoke. He was still in the same clothes, unable to muster the energy to use the voucher for the big box store to get new ones. The kitten just stared, her blue eyes unblinking. He sat on the cold tile floor, his back against the door frame, and just stayed there. He didn't try to approach. He just wanted her to know she wasn't alone in the room. He must have dozed off because he woke with a stiff neck to the sound of a tiny, tentative lap. His eyes snapped open. She was at the water bowl, drinking with a frantic, desperate urgency. But the second she saw him move, she froze, a single droplet of water clinging to her chin. And then she vanished back into her corner, a blur of gray, movement. It was a start. A tiny, fragile crack in the wall. He began to learn her language. It was a language of silence and small movements. He learned that if he moved too quickly, the sound of his footsteps on the motel carpet was enough to make her flinch, her whole body tensing. So he moved slowly, deliberately. He learned that if he talked to her in a low, steady murmur, telling her about the useless phone calls, about the dumb pattern on the motel curtains, about the memory of what his apartment smelled like before, the smoke. Her ears would twitch, just slightly, rotating towards the sound of his voice like tiny satellite dishes. She was listening. On the third day, he went to the store. He walked the aisles, feeling like a ghost, and bought a few things. A package of plain chicken from the deli, a new, softer towel, a small, fuzzy blanket, and another felt mouse, identical to the one she'd saved. He brought it all back and placed the new mouse beside the old, charred one. He shredded a piece of the plain chicken onto a small plate and placed it halfway between her box and the doorway. Then he sat on the floor, his laptop open on his knees, pretending to scroll through job listings he had no hope of getting. He watched from his periphery. It took 20 minutes. A small nose appeared, sniffing the air. Then, a slow, creeping emergence. She slunk low to the ground, a tiny gray shadow, her eyes fixed on him. She approached the chicken as if it were a trap, pausing every few inches. She snatched a piece of meat and retreated to her box to eat it. Then again, and again, until the plate was clean. It was the most food she'd eaten since the fire. That night he lay in the dark motel bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. He thought about the silence in his old apartment, the heavy, lonely silence that this kitten had quietly filled. He hadn't even realized it until it was almost gone. Have you ever had an animal wait for you, even when you didn't ask them to? He hadn't asked for her. He'd just found her. And in finding her, he'd given himself a reason to come home, even to a home he hated. And she had waited for him. Every day. In her shoebox. And then, she had waited for him in the alley, through the fire and the chaos, because some deep, inexplicable instinct told her he would come. The fourth day brought rain, a cold, relentless drizzle that tapped against the motel window. The gray light made the room feel even smaller, more claustrophobic. Leo's anxiety was a live wire. The week was halfway over. The motel voucher would expire. The insurance was a nightmare of hold music and denied claims. He felt the walls closing in, the same old feeling of failure rising in his throat like bile. He was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, just trying to breathe, trying to push the panic down. He didn't hear her approach. He felt it. A whisper of movement against his leg, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. He slowly lifted his head. She was there, sitting just a foot away from him, not in her box, not hiding. Out in the open space of the motel room. She was watching him, her head tilted. Her body was still low to the ground, ready to flee. But she was there. He didn't move. He barely breathed. She took a step closer, then another. Her nose twitched, sniffing the air around him, smelling his sadness, his fear. He could see the fine details of her fur now, the patches where the ash was finally grooming itself out, the delicate pink of her nose. She looked from his face to his hand, which was resting on his knee. She leaned forward, ever so slowly, and stretched her neck out. He held his breath, and then it happened. The smallest, most monumental gesture. She didn't rub against him. She didn't headbutt his hand. She simply extended her neck a fraction of an inch further and touched the tip of her nose to his knuckle. It was cooler than he expected. A tiny, damp, impossibly gentle point of contact. It lasted less than a second. A sniff. A recognition. A question. "Are you okay?" Then she turned and walked, with a new kind of purpose, not a slinking retreat, but a calm walk back to her bathroom sanctuary. She paused at the doorway, looked back at him once, and then disappeared inside. Leo sat on the floor, his hands still frozen in place, the spot where her nose had touched him tingling. The panic was gone. The crushing weight of his circumstances was still there, but it felt different. It felt shared. He wasn't alone in this sterile, terrible room. He had a friend, a tiny, four-legged, smoke-stained survivor who had just trusted him with the most vulnerable part of herself. She had broken the distance. She had crossed the room. She had reached out. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a shuddering sigh that was part sob, part laugh. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside, for the first time since the fire, a tiny, fragile warmth began to bloom. The world outside the motel window began to move again, but for Leo and the kitten, whose name had quietly become Ember in the private spaces of his mind, time took on a different shape. It wasn't measured in job interviews or rejected applications anymore. It was measured in increments of trust, the slow blink from across the room that he learned to return. The way she would now emerge from the bathroom not just for food, but to sit in a sliver of sunlight on the scratchy orange carpet, grooming herself with a fastidiousness that seemed at odds with their temporary, shabby surroundings. She was putting herself back together, piece by piece, and in some small way, so was he. He'd used the voucher finally, and bought a few changes of clothes, a cheap prepaid phone to replace the one that was slowly dying, and a proper cat carrier. The woman at the store had smiled at the items. "New kitten?" she'd asked. Leo had just nodded, a strange lump in his throat. It felt like more than that. It felt like an adoption, a mutual rescue pact signed in soot and silence. They fell into a routine. Mornings were for the soft sound of kibble hitting a bowl and the slow, careful lap of water. Afternoons were for Leo making calls from the edge of the bed, his voice a low, steady drone of frustration, while Ember would watch him from her sunspot, her tail giving a single, faint twitch at the sound of a raised voice or a slammed phone. Evenings were the best. As the sky outside the window turned a deep, bruised purple, she would grow bolder. She'd venture onto the bed, not near him, but on the far corner, curling up on the stiff floral spread. He'd watch her, the steady rise and fall of her small body, and for the first time in a long time, his own breathing would sync with something other than his anxiety. But a new pattern began, subtle and strange, a thread of mystery woven into their fragile new normal. It started with the heating vent. The motel's climate control was an ancient, groaning thing, and a floor vent near the bathroom would rattle to life with a blast of dry, dusty heat every few hours. Leo noticed that Ember had developed a fascination with it. She would sit before it, perfectly still, her ears pricked forward, her entire being focused on the grill as the warm air stirred her fine gray fur. At first, he thought she just liked the warmth. It made sense. She'd been through a trauma. Seeking comfort in heat was logical. But it was more than that. Her focus was too intense, too specific. It wasn't the relaxed posture of a creature basking in warmth. It was the posture of a hunter listening for prey. Her head would tilt, her whiskers would quiver, and she'd let out a sound he'd never heard from her before. Not a meow, not a purr, but a low, almost inaudible chirp, a tiny ek-ek-ek sound that seemed directed into the metal slats. Then, one afternoon, he saw her paw, a tiny white mittened thing, carefully, deliberately, slide through the grill of the vent. She wasn't just sitting there. She was interacting with it. She was trying to get into it. A cold dread, entirely separate from his usual worries, trickled down Leo's spine. What was in there? Was it mice? Rats? The thought of her encountering a rat in that dark metal space made his blood run cold. She was so small. Or was it something else? A draft from another room? A sound only she could hear? He found himself getting down on his hands and knees when she wasn't looking, pressing his ear to the grill. He heard nothing but the distant, hollow moan of the building's ductwork and the faint smell of burnt dust. "What is it, little one?" he murmured to her one evening as she performed her ritual. She ignored him. Her entire world narrowed to the vent. She chirped again, a sound of pure frustration, and hooked her claws into the grill, giving it a small, futile shake. The behavior began to dictate her schedule. She'd nap, eat, use her litter box, and then take up her post at the vent, a small sentinel waiting for a sign. She started disappearing for longer periods into the bathroom. And Leo, his worry getting the better of him, would crack the door to find her not in her box, but with her head pressed against the wall near the baseboard. Listening. It was as if the wall itself was speaking to her, and he was locked out of the conversation. His old fears began to resurface, tinted with this new, specific anxiety. The fear of losing her. This fragile connection, this thing that had become the anchor of his shattered world, felt threatened by a mystery he couldn't solve. What if she became obsessed? What if she found a way to pry the vent open and got lost in the walls of this terrible, anonymous building? The thought was a physical pain. He'd lie awake at night, listening to the hum of the fridge, and now, instead of counting his failures, he'd be listening for the sound of her scratching at metal. He tried to distract her. He'd jiggle the new mouse toy, the red one, dragging it across the carpet. She'd watch for a moment, her instinct engaged, but her focus would inevitably drift back to the vent. It was the only thing that held her complete attention. He bought her a catnip banana from the pet store, a ridiculous-looking thing, but the videos online showed cats going wild for them. Ember sniffed it, gave it a dismissive bat, and walked back to her post. Her singular focus felt like a rejection. It picked at the scab of his loneliness. He had thought they were building something together, a quiet understanding in the ruins, but now it felt like she had a secret life, a purpose he wasn't part of. Do you think animals know things we can't? That they sense things we're blind to? He watched her, this tiny creature who had walked through fire to bring him a toy, and he felt a bewildering sense of jealousy toward a heating vent. The days ticked by. The motel voucher had a finality to it now. He'd secured another week through a charity, but the reprieve was temporary. The real world was waiting, and it didn't include a place for them. His anxiety about the future and his anxiety about Ember's strange behavior began to braid together into a single, tight knot in his stomach. One rainy Tuesday, the shift happened. He came back from a dismal, pointless interview at a warehouse, his shoes soaked, his spirit damp. He pushed open the motel room door, expecting to see her at the vent, as usual. But the room was still. The vent was cold and silent. Her food, bowl from the morning, was still full. A jolt of pure panic shot through him. "Ember?" he called out, his voice too loud in the quiet room. He dropped his bag and rushed to the bathroom. Empty. Her box was empty. The towel was cold. He dropped to his knees, looking under the bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing. Just dust bunnies and the lonely gleam of the red mouse toy. No. 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 This couldn't be happening. Not after everything. Had she gotten out? Had housekeeping come in? He felt the walls of the room closing in, the air getting thin. He was losing her. He was going to be alone in this again. And then he heard it. A sound. Not from the vent. From the closet. A small, dim space he never used, filled with his few new hanging clothes and the empty shelves above. It was a soft, rhythmic sound. A sound he knew. A sound that defied all the panic coursing through him. It was the sound of purring. It was a low, steady, contented rumble, like a tiny motor humming in the dark. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He crept toward the closet door, which was slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly, afraid to break the spell. There she was, curled not on the floor, not on a shelf, but in the hollow of one of his new sweaters. The gray cashmere one he'd bought because it felt like a promise of a softer future. She was nestled deep in the folds, her body relaxed, her eyes half closed, in pure bliss. And she was purring. Not the anxious purr of a scared animal, but the deep, resonant purr of absolute, perfect contentment. She looked up at him as the light fell on her, and she didn't startle. She didn't stop purring. She just looked at him, and in her blue eyes, there was no mystery, no obsession, no fear. There was only a simple, profound peace. She had abandoned her post at the vent. She had chosen the scent of him, the softness of his sweater, the dark and quiet safety of his space. The relief that washed over Leo was so powerful it buckled his knees. He sank to the floor beside the closet, tears of sheer release welling in his eyes. She was here. She was safe. And she was happy. But as he sat there, listening to her purr, the question returned, softer now, but still persistent. Why? Why the vent? What had she been listening for? What had she been trying to find? The mystery hadn't solved itself. It had just been postponed. She had chosen him today, over the vent. But the vent was still there, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that her fascination with it wasn't over. It was a thread left dangling, and he had no idea where it led, or what it meant. He only knew that the peace of this moment was temporary. Something had changed in her routine. She had let him in, only to show him that there was still a door he couldn't open. The peace was a fragile thing, a soap bubble glistening in the air, beautiful and destined to pop. For 2 days, Leo let himself believe it might last. Ember slept curled in his sweater, her purr a constant, soothing vibration in the quiet of the motel room. She followed him from room to room, not with the skittishness of before, but with a quiet companionship, her tail held in a gentle question mark. She would even, tentatively, hop onto the bed while he was reading, settling just a foot away from his legs, a proximity that felt like a miracle. He found himself talking to her more, telling her about the handful of leads he'd gotten, a possible, temporary job stacking shelves, a friend of a friend who might have a couch he could crash on. It all still felt impossibly precarious, but the crushing weight had lessened. He wasn't carrying it alone, but the vent was still there. He tried to ignore it. He'd drape a towel over it, turn the TV on to mask its rattle when the heat kicked on. But Ember knew. Her ears would flick towards it, a subtle betrayal of her focus. The purring would stop mid-rumble. Her body would tense, just for a second, before she'd consciously relax again, pressing her head more firmly against his leg as if to reassure him or herself. She was fighting it, this pull for him, and that was almost worse. It meant the obsession was still there, simmering under the surface of their hard-won peace. The mystery of it became a presence in the room, a third occupant. It lived in the slight distance in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. It was in the way she'd sometimes just stop, mid-step, and stare at the wall with an intensity that felt ancient, unknowable. Leo's worry curdled into a low-grade dread. Was she sick? Was there something in the walls? Was the fire, the smoke, had it damaged something in her tiny brain? The vet had said she was fine, but what if she'd missed something? What if this was a sign of some slow, internal injury? The thought was unbearable. The breaking point came on a Thursday. The sky was a flat, iron gray, threatening more rain. Leo was on the phone with the insurance adjuster for the 3rd time that week, being passed from department to department, each voice more disinterested than the last. He was perched on the edge of the bed, his free hand clenching and unclenching, the frustration a hot coil in his chest. Ember was on the floor, playing half-heartedly with the red mouse toy, batting it under the dresser and fishing it out again. The heat vent shuddered to life with its familiar metallic groan. She froze. The mouse was forgotten. Her entire body went still, then pointed towards the vent like a compass needle finding true north. She didn't chirp this time. She didn't approach. She just sat there, and she began to cry. It wasn't a meow. It was a sound Leo had never heard from any animal. It was a low, guttural, heartbroken wail, It was a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. It was so profoundly sad, so full of a loss he couldn't comprehend, that it severed the last thread of his composure. "I'm going to have to call you back," he said into the phone, his voice strangled, and he ended the call without waiting for a response. He threw the phone onto the bedspread. The insurance, the job, the motel bill, it all vanished from his mind. There was only this tiny creature and her bottomless sorrow. "Ember," he whispered, his own throat tight. "What is it? What's wrong?" She ignored him, her cries continuing, each one a small, devastating knife to his heart. She was looking at the vent, but she was seeing something else. Something from the fire, something from before, and in a flash he understood. He didn't know what he understood, but he knew it wasn't mice, it wasn't rats, it wasn't a draft. This was memory. This was grief. This was a sound she'd heard, a smell she'd carried, a loss she'd endured that was trapped behind. That metal grill. She wasn't trying to get into the vent. She was trying to get back to something, something she thought was in there. He couldn't stand it anymore. He couldn't watch her hurt like this. He crossed the room, his movements decisive now, the helplessness burned away by a fierce, protective need. He had to know. He had to end this, for her. He got down on his knees in front of the vent. Ember's crying softened to a pitiful whimper, her wide, wet eyes watching him, a new kind of intensity in them. Not obsession, but hope. The vent cover was cheap, thin metal, held in place by 2 Phillips head screws, painted over so many times they were nearly smooth. He didn't have a screwdriver. He looked around the room, his gaze frantic, landing on his keyring. The small key to his old apartment, useless now, had a decently sharp edge. He jammed it into the groove of one screw and twisted. His hand slipped, the key scraping his knuckle, drawing a thin line of blood. He didn't care. He tried again, putting all his weight into it, his breath coming in ragged grunts. The paint cracked. The screw turned, just a millimeter. It took 10 minutes of painful, frustrating work, his fingers cramping, his knuckles bleeding. Ember sat just behind him, silent now, her entire being focused on his struggle. She wasn't crying anymore. She was waiting. Finally, with a last gritty twist, both screws were out. He carefully pried the vent cover away from the wall. It came free with a soft sigh of accumulated dust. The opening was black, a square mouth leading into the dark, cold belly of the building. A smell wafted out. Not the burnt dust he'd expected, but the damp, cold scent of concrete and loneliness. It was the smell of a space that had never seen the sun. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and shone it into the darkness. The duct went back about 2 feet before bending sharply, downward. It was a dead end, empty, just sheet metal, dust, and a few straggly bits of insulation. A profound sense of anticlimax washed over him. There was nothing here. It was all in her head. She was traumatized, and he was a fool for thinking he could fix it with a screwdriver and a phone light. He started to pull back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He'd have to find a way to cover the hole, call the vet again. Maybe there was medication. A tiny flash of white in the beam of his light. It was tucked deep in the corner, right where the duct bent downward, almost invisible. Not a piece of insulation. Something else. Something. Deliberate. His heart thudded once, hard against his ribs. He leaned further in, ignoring the dust, the cold metal against his cheek. He stretched his arm, his fingers straining, brushing against the thing. It was soft. Felt like yarn. He closed his fingers around it and pulled it gently into the light. It was a small, clumsily made doll, a poppet, no bigger than his thumb. It was made of white yarn, tied in the middle to form a head and a body. It was old, dusty, covered in the grime of the duct, but unmistakably handmade. Tied around its middle was a single long strand of gray hair, wound several times and knotted with exquisite care. Leo held it in his palm, the tiny thing feeling immense, heavy with meaning he couldn't grasp. What was this? How did it get there? It looked ancient, like something a child would make generations ago. He looked from the doll in his hand to Ember, She was staring at it, her body trembling all over. She let out a small, choked sound. Not a cry of grief, but a sound of recognition, of finding. And then she moved. She didn't approach the doll. She approached him. She walked right up to his knees, where he was kneeling on the floor, covered in dust and blood. She looked up at his face, her blue eyes clear and deep and full of a wisdom that shook him to his core. Do you think they know when we're at our lowest? They don't just know. They remember. They carry the memories we can't see. She rose up on her hind legs, placing her 2 white front paws gently on his thigh to steady herself. She leaned forward, her whiskers brushing his wrist, and she pressed her head, not against the doll, but against the center of his palm, right where the tiny yarn figure lay. It was the same spot her nose had touched days before, but this was different. This wasn't a question. This was an answer. This was a transfer, a completion. She held the pose, her head bowed into his hand, her body pouring out a purr so loud and strong it vibrated up his arm and into his own chest, shaking loose something that had been stuck inside him for years. He finally understood. The vent, the sounds, the crying. It wasn't about her. It never had been. She hadn't been trying to get back to something she'd lost. She had been trying to give him something she'd found. This tiny ghost, this survivor, had walked through the inferno of his old building and had somehow, in the chaos and the darkness, discovered this last lost piece of someone else's story, and she had carried the memory of it with her. She had brought it here, and she had been trying, day after day, to tell him where she'd hidden it, to give him this one small, perfect thing that had survived the fire. This proof that even in total destruction, something fragile and beautiful could endure. A sob ripped from Leo's throat, raw and unfiltered. The tears came then, hot and fast, streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the dust on his cheeks. He wasn't just crying for the doll, or for the unknown story it represented. He was crying for the immense, unknowable love of this small creature who had appointed herself the keeper of lost things. This hero nobody expected. He curled his fingers gently around the yarn doll, and with his other hand, he cupped it over Ember's head, holding her there, feeling the thunder of her purr, the solid, real warmth of her life. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the cheap motel carpet, in the dust and the dim light, the open mouth of the vent forgotten behind them. The mystery was solved. The weight was gone. She had given him her gift. And he finally saw what she had been trying to tell him all along, that they were both survivors, and that they were both now keepers. The world didn't magically fix itself overnight. The insurance claims were still a nightmare of paperwork. The job, stacking shelves, was mind-numbingly boring. The new apartment wasn't really an apartment at all, but a studio over a garage that a co-worker's friend was renting out cheap. It smelled of old motor oil, and the windows rattled when the trains went by. It was small, it was shabby, and it was theirs. The yarn doll lived in a small, clear dish on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. Leo had washed it gently, the grime of decades swirling down the drain, revealing the bright, almost defiant white of the yarn. The single gray hair, now clean, seemed to glow in the light. He didn't know its story, and he knew he never would. Was it a child's forgotten treasure, slipped through a floorboard grate in a home that no longer existed? A secret, a wish, a spell against loneliness? It didn't matter. Its story had ended in the fire. Ember had found it, and she had given it a new one. Its story was theirs now. A relic. A testament. A quiet, stubborn flag planted in the soil of their new life, declaring that they were still here. Mornings in the studio were different. The light that came through the rattling windows was pale and dust-flecked, but it was honest light. Leo would wake to the feeling of a small, warm weight settled in the hollow between his shoulder and his chin. Ember slept there now, every night, her body a soft, rumbling furnace against his throat, her paws sometimes kneading the stubble on his cheek in her dreams. He'd lie still for long minutes, just breathing her in, the scent of her fur, clean now, like sunshine and cat, a balm, against the lingering smell of smoke that still sometimes haunted his own dreams. She no longer cried at heating vents. The obsession had vanished the moment he'd held the doll in his hand. It was as if her mission was complete. Her entire demeanor had softened, relaxed into the cat she was always meant to be. Playful, mischievous, deeply affectionate. She'd chase the red mouse toy with a ferocious joy, skidding across the bare wood floors. She'd nap in sunbeams, her belly exposed, a picture of absolute trust. She'd sit on the arm of the second-hand couch while he scrolled through job listings on his new, cheap phone, and she'd pat his screen with a gentle paw whenever his shoulders would tense up as if to say, "Enough of that. Look at me instead." Leo did look. He found himself watching her more than he watched any screen. He saw the way she investigated every corner of their new home, not with fear, but with curiosity. She claimed it, piece by piece. This was her windowsill. This was her spot under the radiator. This was her corner of the couch. She was teaching him how to do the same. How to stop seeing the cracks in the ceiling and start seeing the way the light moved across the wall in the afternoon. How to stop hearing the rattle of the trains and start hearing the quiet, the profound, blessed quiet of a night with no sirens. He started to change, in small, almost imperceptible ways. He bought a plant, a resilient little succulent from the grocery store. He put it on the windowsill next to the yarn doll. He remembered to water it. He cooked simple meals for himself, and the smell of garlic and onions would mix with the scent of motor oil from below, and it would somehow smell like a life being built, not just endured. He talked to Ember while he cooked, telling her about his day, the rude customer, the nice old lady who'd asked about his cat. She'd sit on the small formica table, her tail twitching, listening as if she understood every word. The heavy leaden cloak of his loneliness began to feel lighter. It was still there, he could still feel its weight, but it was no longer suffocating him. It was just a coat he could take off at the end of the day and hang by the door. Ember had given him that. She had shown him that being alone and being lonely were not the same thing. She had filled the silence not with noise, but with presence. Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of their life became a gentle, steady beat. Work, home, dinner, the soft weight of a cat on his chest as he read. It was a simple life, an unremarkable life, and it was the most precious thing he had ever owned. One Saturday, he decided to finally unpack the last box. It was a small one, filled with the things the Red Cross had managed to salvage and clean from the few items he'd left in his lobby locker. A twisted, water-stained bundle of old letters from his parents, a warped external hard drive he doubted would work, and a few items of clothing that still smelled, faintly, of smoke. It was a box of ghosts, and he'd been avoiding it. He sat on the floor with it, Ember circling the box with interest, her nose twitching at the familiar, acrid scent. He pulled out the clothes, deciding what to keep, what to finally let go. He pulled out the hard drive, setting it aside as a problem for another day. He pulled out the bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The ribbon disintegrated at his touch. And then, at the very bottom of the box, nestled in a fold of a smoke-stained sweatshirt, he saw it. Another mouse. Not the red one from the store. Not the charred felt one she had saved. This one was different. Older. It was made of gray felt, worn thin and soft with love, its ears slightly chewed, its tail a braided piece of yarn that had come partially undone. It was the first mouse, the one from his childhood, the one that had lived on his bed throughout high school, through his first heartbreak, through the long, lonely nights after his parents died. He'd brought it with him to his first apartment, a stupid, sentimental comfort, and then, embarrassed by it, he'd shoved it in the back of his locker, forgetting it was even there. He hadn't saved it. He hadn't even remembered it. But the fire had spared it. The water had cleaned it. And the Red Cross volunteers, in their meticulous, compassionate work, had found it. And they had sent it home to him. He held it in his hand, this tiny, worn piece of his own history, this symbol of a comfort he had long since outgrown, or so he'd thought. He looked from the mouse in his hand to the yarn doll on the windowsill. Two relics, two survivors. One from a past he didn't know, and one from a past he'd tried to forget. Ember came over then. She sniffed the old gray mouse, and a deep rolling purr started in her chest immediately. It was a purr of recognition, of completion. She looked up at him. And then she did something she had never done before. She gently took the mouse from his loose fingers, her teeth careful, not to harm it, but to carry it. She turned and walked. Away, her tail held high. She carried it across the room, past her food bowl, past the red mouse toy, and she jumped onto the windowsill. She nosed the yarn doll gently, affectionately, as if introducing an old friend to a new one. Then, with a delicate precision, she placed the old gray mouse right beside it. She arranged it just so, giving it a final nudge with her head. Then she sat between them, looking out the window at the world, her two treasures side by side in the sunlight. A curator of lost things finally satisfied. Leo watched her. The tears, in his eyes not of sadness, but of a overwhelming, breathtaking gratitude. She had done it again. She had given him another gift. Not just the mouse, but the meaning. She had connected the dots of his life. She had taken the lonely, forgotten comfort of his childhood and placed it right next to the mysterious, salvaged hope from the fire. She was showing him that his story hadn't started with the loss. It had started long before, and it had continued through the flames, and it was still being written, right here, in this imperfect, beautiful room. He was not the man he was before the fire. That man was Ash. He was someone new, someone softer, someone who knew that the smallest things, a purr in the dark, a touch of a nose, a saved toy, a found doll, could be the strongest things in the world. They were the things that could pull you from the wreckage of your own life and lead you home. Love doesn't always arrive as a grand rescue. Sometimes, it's a quiet survivor, covered in soot, offering you the one piece of your heart you didn't even know was missing. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.